How many of you have, since we started the series, gone and watched one of the Christmas Carol versions? Or no one? Are you guys readers? Did you go read? Oh no, not that either. I love it, but it's way too hot. So I went and watched this weekend, or a few days ago, the Spirited, the sort of most recent adaptation that came out last year. It's with Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds. It's a musical. It's not really a retelling. It's kind of like an expansion of the story. It's good. I can't talk about it too much, because the story's interesting and there's twists and things you don't expect. So I would recommend it if you want a fresh take on Dickens' story. I am a masochist. I did go read some of it this weekend, just sort of this part for today, the Ghost of Christmas Present part. Man, it was eye-opening. If you haven't seen it or read it in a while, I forgot some of the stuff that happens. We're going to talk about it today. But, we've been examining Scrooge's redemption through this series and playing with the idea that, Scrooge is not a derogatory name, right? If we are remembering the story, if we remember the transformation, if we accept that it happened, we should all strive to be Scrooges. Like the Grinch story last year, right? We get hung up on this idea of who the character was and not who they became. So today, Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas Present. And this is cool this week, because this is where we begin to see the first signs of change in Scrooge. The first two ghosts, when he was visited by Marley, the ghost of Christmas Past, he's reluctant to speak to them. He's reluctant to go with them. He tries to write it off as food poisoning, right? He doesn't believe that these things are happening. And then this next ghost shows up. He's actually waiting for it. He's awake in his bed when the clock strikes the next hour. And the ghost comes, and the ghost bids him come with him, and Scrooge goes willingly. And he whisks Scrooge to and fro around town. This part you probably remember. He goes and he sees people in the streets, people traveling to their friends' homes, their families' homes to celebrate Christmas Day, gathering and eating, and they spend a lot of time at his nephew's house. Spends a lot of time with Bob Cratchit, right? And the Cratchit household is warm, it's friendly. They describe this modest feast that they have saved all year. The whole family is there. The kids have come home. The kids that had grown and have their own jobs come home. The kids that are still too young are there. And they feast, and they spends a long time laboring over this pudding that Mrs. Cratchit made that sounds very delicious. And then they play games, and Scrooge forgets that he's not really there, and he joins in the games. They play 20 questions, and he's throwing out answers. And in that time, if you remember, they raise a toast to Scrooge, the founder of the feast, since he is the one who pays their family. He is the employer. And most of the family gets upset, but toast is raised nevertheless, and they refuse to curse his name, just to go to show the goodwill that they have, the things that they are fortunate for, even if they don't have as much as Scrooge might. And then he continues. This part maybe isn't in all of the adaptations, but they leave the Cratchit home and they go and they visit these other Christmas scenes throughout the country. They visit a mining village where they're celebrating, a lighthouse where two men are clinking drinks, cheering to Christmas. And then they go back. And do you remember what happens at the very end of this visit of the Ghost of Christmas Present? It's haunting. Dickens spends a lot of time, most of this story is spent in these happy parts to make this last part hit so much harder, to set us up for the dark turn these final moments take. So Scrooge notices the ghost is there. He's got this big green robe on, covering his whole body. And he notices something protruding from the ghost's legs. And he says, "What is that under your robe? What do you have there?" And he pulls back the robe to reveal two children clinging to his legs. And Dickens writes, he describes them, they are wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, and miserable children. I went to go watch the 2009 animated version of this story, the Jim Carrey one. We hadn't really figured out the secret to animation in 2009 yet. But I watched this scene, It is horrifying. I'm going to have nightmares about it. The way that they show these children and the sort of transformations they take as they bring this scene to life, I thought about showing a clip of it, but it's too much. It's on YouTube if you want to find it on your own. But wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They understood the assignment. And I want to read just the section from the original text that they write about this, because it's heart-wrenching the way that it gets played out. They were a boy and a girl, appearing yellow, thin, ragged, scowling like wolves. Yet they were also completely humbled and prostrate in their demeanor. Instead of the expected youthful grace that should have defined their features with fresh colors, a withered hand reminiscent of old age distorted their appearance. Where angels might have been envisioned, devils instead lurked, casting menacing glares. No transformation, degradation, or distortion of humanity across all the wonders of creation has produced monsters as terrible and dreadful as these. Scrooge recoiled, horrified. Seeing them in this manner, he attempted to praise them as fine children, but the words choked in his throat, unwilling to participate in such an enormous lie. "Spirit," he said, "are they yours?" The Spirit replied, "They belong to humanity. They appeal to me, seeking refuge from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of both and all of their kind, but especially beware of this boy, for on his brow I see a mark that signifies doom unless it is erased. Slander those who speak of it, exploit it for your own divisive purposes, and make it worse, and face the consequences." And then the part from our reading, "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. And the Spirit retorted, echoing Scrooge's own words for the last time, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And the worst part is, Dickens did not make this up. He described these children from what he had seen in his own life, in his own community. The description of these children, the whole impetus for writing this story, The Christmas Carol, is based on actual experiences that Charles Dickens had with the ragged schools. Have you heard of the ragged schools? These are the earliest precursors to what might be called modern education. Dickens wrote about them in a letter to the Daily News like this. He said, "The name implies the purpose. Those who are too ragged, wretched, filthy, or forlorn to enter any other place, who could gain admission to no charity school, who would be driven away from the church door, are invited to come in here to the ragged schools and find some people who are not depraved, people who are willing to teach them something, show them some sympathy, stretch out a hand, that which is not the iron hand of the law, for their correction." It is hard to read about this situation, but these ragged schools were a godsend. Dickens was a fierce advocate for education. He's tearing them down in this letter, not out of opposition to them, out of a longing for reformation. And he was one of the people who worked to improve the conditions in these schools. Things were so bad, he once donated a trough to the school so that the boys would have a place to wash themselves. It's hard to read about, but this was the start of free education for the society's most downtrodden, the idea of equity, that everyone deserves a chance, a glimmer of hope for those trying to break the cycle of poverty. As we read in that introduction, the whole purpose of this is to point out the inequity between the rich and the poor in these societies, to shed a light on it so people might not live in that ignorance of those around them. Though the conditions were miserable, the teachers were overworked volunteers, the children would have otherwise had no refuge or resource. They were given a chance because the community was willing to come together and provide some equity for their neighbors. This was totally community funded, totally a charity, volunteered hours. They had maybe a few teachers on staff sometimes. But the success of these schools demonstrated the need, the demand for public education among those who experienced poverty, as if it wasn't obvious before, as if the demand needed to be pointed out that, oh, these people may want a chance at an education. And there's a direct through line. You can trace the history of these that led to the first foundation, the creation of elementary schools and the public school system in England, when the government took it over and provided the funding. We know that education is absolutely vital to breaking cycles of poverty. We all know that. We know how many educators we have here in our community, in our church, and yet we continue to foster a multi-tiered education system. The quality of public education depends directly on how wealthy your community is. Even within a school, students' experience may vary because public education is still not completely free, is it? Did you know just this year, Indiana passed a law so that parents and families no longer have to pay textbook fees? 2023 is when we started doing that. It was upwards of $150 per student every year, like on average across the state. It is expensive. Now, they didn't add what? That's right. They didn't add money to the budget, and they didn't cover all the costs to actually fund this program. And this program, the way it's funded, comes out of the same budget as teachers' salaries. So our hearts are in the right place. and these fees weren't completely eliminated. Schools can still charge technology fees for things like iPads, Chromebooks, for the programs they use. So it's still around $20 or $30 per student a year in some places. And I read an interview with a parent about these fees, and she said, don't get me wrong, we're only being charged a fraction of what we were. But it's almost a matter of principle, right? Aren't the fees supposed to be zeroed out? Shouldn't everyone have the same access and opportunity? And she is absolutely right. She's absolutely right, because those are just the textbook fees, right? What if your student wants to join the band, or a show choir, or do a club, or a sport? Most of these have extra fees, not to mention the burden of providing transportation, reliable transportation for your student to get them to and from these activities. The burden families have is enormous, and those who don't have an abundance of time or resources just don't get the same opportunities, do they? And I'm sure I've talked about this before, but school lunches are another sticking point for me on this, and it makes my blood boil, because and what's worse is we got it right for a few years. For 2020 and 2021, there was a federal program to subsidize the cost of school lunches. Everyone got free school lunch. And then in 2022, we're just like, no more. We'll go back to the old way. And the problem with doing that is that school lunch debt is on the rise again. School lunch debt, a phrase that should not be in our vocabulary. People should not go into debt to have to buy the school lunches. But many of the families who were on the free and reduced lunch program didn't sign back up after the program restarted because they hadn't had to do it for a few years. And 45% of students in Indiana qualify for this program. 45% of our students. And since there are no laws that govern how schools handle lunch accounts, balances, once your student's account reaches zero, you're at the mercy of the district. Some schools will let you run up a debt, and then if it's past a certain point, they'll send you to collections at the end of the school year. So you'll have that hounding you for however long it takes to pay that off. Some schools just don't let you eat lunch, so then you don't run up a debt. Or in the best case scenarios, the schools will give you the free lunch, which is a Kraft single on white bread and a carton of milk. And there may be a vegetable now, I'm not sure. Free of charge, though. I could go on and on about this topic. The ways that our school systems are running, there's a lot of good that happens there, but there is a lot of room for improvement, right? I could go on and on about how poverty leads to instability, how some seats in our classrooms become revolving doors for families who face eviction, with the rising cost of housing. How we have teenagers who can't read in our classrooms because they've never been in the same school for more than a few months because of this eviction problem. How the weight of our educational system is laid mostly on our teachers who are overworked and underpaid. The most frustrating part is that so many of these problems are solvable. So many of the problems facing our children can be solved if we were willing to dedicate the time and the resources to it. If we were willing to look at them. Look upon me, the ghost screams at Scrooge. Witness the children of ignorance and want. Take them in and consider them. We have to be willing to observe the problems of this world, to take them in, to consider them. We have to be willing to act, not in our own best interests, but in the best interests of the community. But it takes communities and it takes leaders who want to see a change, who want to make that change happen. We all know that our systems are slow. Turning something around is like a barge in the ocean. It takes a long time. It takes consistent and persistent effort to enact permanent solutions. But that's where the church steps in, isn't it? We're there in the meantime, while the systems are being changed. We are there in the waiting. We are the hope for the hopeless. We are the stopgap and the safety net for the outsiders and the left behinds and the ones falling through the cracks. And this story of Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas Present, it's only the end that we get this bleak bit. The rest of it is joy and it is merry, because we have to be able to hold opposing ideas in our mind at the same time. We have to be aware of the things that are happening around us, but it does not have to stop us from experiencing the joy in this world. We had Plum Jubilee Christmas here yesterday. Thank you to those who were here. It was wonderful. And I don't know if you saw the ledger out there on your way in, but after last week, we balanced it. We've raised all the funds we need. We had all the toys that we needed for these families. 37 families, over 100 children that we were able to give gifts to and provide for, and we gave food. The joy and excitement of those people, it's so wonderful to see them in person, have them come in and select their own gifts to help them prepare for Christmas. And one of the best parts was at the end. We had this real loaves and fishes moment where there were still plenty of toys after all the families had come through. There were plenty of cookies, and we got to send those off to the central distribution, wherever that is. And so the people who didn't miss their chance to sign up late, whatever, also get a chance to have and share in that joy. The ghost shows Scrooge the joys and the sorrows of his community. We can share in the joys of Christmas without ignoring the reality of injustice that still exists. The story that we read today in Matthew, Jesus is born, the Magi come, they share their gifts, but then Herod, in his selfishness and his arrogance, forces them to flee. The joys and the sorrows. As we have been singing at the beginning of every service, the promise of Advent is that the miracle has just begun. The coming of the Christ child, the death and the resurrection of Jesus was just the start of the work of the church. It continues today, it continues through us. We must be willing to look upon the world and know that love is what we are made for. Love is what we must share. And we must look not only in the bright places, but the dark places. And we must be the light that shines into that darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. Amen.